It's a pleasure to be here. And what I thought I'd do with the few moments that I have at the start of the conference is just make a few remarks about the potential, or indeed, I think, the necessity of cross-disciplinary research, especially when it comes to issues of climate change. This, I think, is of importance for the conference because, of course, you have been invited, in a sense, to speak across, to work across, to have dialogue across sciences, social sciences, humanities, and arts. And with that in mind, I thought it would be useful for you to start with some reflections on this. It's also something that I am interested in myself in my own research, because my own research also works intensely on the questions of cross-disciplinarity and why it's important to think about the world in a cross-disciplinary manner in relation to climate change in particular. Now, my aim, though, is not in any way to try to conclude on or restrict or to even give guidance on how cross-disciplinary dialogue should take place and what kind of conversations you should or shouldn't have in the conference here today. Indeed, I think what I'll try to do is I'll try to kind of make some provocations, if you like, from my own perspectives as to why it's important to think about cross-disciplinarity in a very, very serious way, and why it's also politically very significant for how we think about climate politics. Now, to give you a sense of where I come from, but also in vein of the conference where we are sharing our own research, I thought I'd actually start by giving you a sense of where I come from in the study of the world. So I study international relations, international politics. That is my background. And in particular, my interest has been for many years on how it is that we come to conceptualize the world in particular kinds of ways, why it is that particular political imaginations seem so inevitable or so kind of all-pervasive. Why do we work with the state system? Why do we have particular conceptions of democracy, or why do also our conceptions of democracy differ? Why do we think that citizens should be individual human beings? Where do these ideas about how we do politics come from? Now, in the context of exploring these ideas for many years, I've also worked a lot around the themes of philosophy of science. And the reason I do that, and many others do too, is that actually a lot of our political concepts, our political belief systems, our political ideologies are actually tied up also with the history of science and how scientific thinking evolved, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, and how it translated to us a particular set of vocabularies about how we think about the nature of the world around us. In this context, I've become very interested in questions of cosmology. And what I mean by cosmology is basically various ways in which we think about the macro structures, if you like, of the universe or pluriverse, depending on how you conceptualize the nature of our existence in the world. But of course, cosmology is also about how we plug ourselves into the universe. It is in part about placing ourselves and our societies and our communities in the world. So what I'm interested in is the study of cosmology, and this crucially involves both engagement with scientific cosmology, that is physicists and natural scientists trying to understand the nature of the cosmos, and it also fundamentally involves studying how people believe particular things about the cosmos around us. In a sense, you cannot deal with cosmology without dealing both scientific as well as kind of cultural beliefs about the world. Why? Partly because the two are fundamentally interconnected. So scientific paradigms of cosmological thinking are also informed by cultural traditions, and our cultural traditions are deeply also influenced by scientific patterns of thought, Newtonianism and other kinds of concepts which actually structure how it is that we think about the nature of the world. The reason I'm interested in these questions is in part that how we cosmologically imagine ourselves and indeed the universe has deep implications for also our political imaginations. That is how we deal with questions like climate change through our politics, how we delimit or open up our visions in terms of how to do politics. So ultimately, those are the reasons that I'm interested in these questions. But as part of in exploring these questions, I'm also having to, and I'm very interested in and have been engaging with a lot of cross-disciplinary working across the sciences, social sciences, and increasingly also, and especially with arts, which I think is actually in some senses the key key contributor to debates on cosmology. Now, let me say a little bit, just a very little bit about relational cosmology, because it is from my thinking and writing around relational cosmology that also very particular ways of thinking about cross-science working, cross-disciplinary working comes from. Relational cosmology is a particular way of thinking about the nature of the universe, which arises from natural sciences, so cosmologists working in physics and related fields of natural sciences on how to understand the nature of the universe. But it has very important and fundamental implications also for all social and political sciences, arts and humanities, and this is why I've been interested in working with it. What does relational cosmology argue? Essentially, relational cosmology argues that physics is having a real trouble in dealing with the kinds of findings that we are actually making about the nature of the universe around us. Whether it's through relativity theories, various relational theories, or various quantum mechanical kind of findings, basically relational cosmologists argue that we need to stop to think about the world in terms of certain kinds of patterns of thought, which are actually still very dominant in the physical sciences. Patterns of thought such as thinking in terms of laws of nature. Patterns of thought such as thinking that maths is a kind of a solution to the puzzle of how we understand the world around us. Patterns of thought such where we think that the universe around us consists of things moving in some sort of a background. Fundamental to relational cosmology is challenging this idea that there are any such things as things in the universe. In fact, to think relationally means to think without things, to think in terms of processes. The universe is processing, including space and time are processes. There are no such things as things in the universe, and crucially, there's no such things as backgrounds in which things move. Why is this important? Well, partly because it's so difficult for us to think without things. I find it very difficult to even express of the world without thinking in terms of things and backgrounds. But this is the challenge that relational cosmologists put to us, both in our physics thinking and in our societal political thinking. We need to be able to try to challenge ourselves in terms of the patterns of thought. Why? Because our patterns of thought, in fact, go back to 16th and 17th century sciences, Newtonian framings of the universe, from which we inherit our conceptual ways of thinking about the nature of the world. Relational cosmology also, interestingly, challenges what it is to know something scientifically. They argue that in a relational universe, we never know anything about the universe inside it or outside it, as if we were somehow at a distance from it. In fact, we're always relationally processing in relations in the universe, and as a result, physics is not objective. We cannot have objective knowledge even in physics. What we have is knowledge from within the historical unfolding of relations in the world. Let me put it this way. For a long time in the social sciences, there has been a kind of a notion that we should be kind of envious of the physical sciences because we need to have objective positive laws that we find in society in order to do proper science. Quite the opposite, relational cosmologists argue that instead of social sciences having physics envy, physics should actually work like historians do. So actually physical sciences should be like historical sciences and humanities in terms of their thinking, that is tracing relational unfolding of the universe historically. Now, you might be wondering, why am I going on about this? Why is this of any relevance, certainly to climate change or to anything also in relation to politics? And the reason this is really important is that actually these certain Newtonian ideas about cosmology also are deeply influential on how we think about politics. So the international order, the idea of the state or the idea of the state system, or indeed the very idea that the political world consists of individual autonomous individuals whose interests are to be represented within the state. All of these ideas have origins in certain kinds of Newtonian ideas about atomism, this idea that we can have individual units called individuals, or indeed individual units called sovereign states. These ideas and also ideas around liberal ideology, for example, the idea that individuals kind of move in the world, the social world, and our role as social scientists is to study their movement in that social space. They're actually Newtonian conceptions in a sense of what's going on. What's important for me then, in some senses, is to kind of point to, in our attention to these kinds of assumptions and the work that they're actually doing and how we think about politics. Politics is not just politics. Politics has been made to become a particular kind of politics because of also scientific paradigms of thought, which actually have origins in certain theological patterns of thought that precede Newtonian ideas of science and so on. Crucially, why does this matter for climate change politics? For me, it matters because our cosmological horizons have, in a sense, created particular patterns of politics which are actually making dealing with climate change problems very difficult. One crucial assumption that is happening here is that we are lifting the humans, if you like, off the planet, and the nature environment becomes kind of a background, an inert material background on which we humans in our human polis, which we in the human polis, in a sense, try to control or try to manage in our interests. But is this really the way in which we should be thinking about the universe, or is this even the way in which we should be thinking about politics? And one of the arguments I've made recently in a book that came out last year called International Relations in a Relational Universe is exactly that we should be trying to move away from these conceptions and actually move towards different kinds of cosmological imaginations. Now, I play with relational cosmology and its implications for how we think about the nature of nature and also the nature of the human, and how that actually creates different kinds of political imaginations. But of course, there are a lot of different ways in which one could actually develop alternative cosmological thought. In fact, in this conference, I know for a fact you will be hearing from Amaya in the next session, in fact, who will be speaking on work that is informed intensely by also decolonial imaginations, different ways of imagining the world in relation to Andean relational cosmology. So there are different ways in which we can think about alternative cosmologies, but let me just say briefly this. For me, what's interesting about relational cosmology is that it challenges the division between so-called humans and so-called nature. In a sense, the artificiality of the creation of the natural and the human comes to full sight through relational cosmology. Many of you are probably familiar with the debates on these questions in the kind of Anthropocene debates in many sciences, many humanities subjects these days. But for me, the interest in this is political. Because if we do not have a human with borders, a sovereign human, and if we do not have nature that is an inert background to us, does it mean that we should do politics across the division of human and nature? That is what I work on at the moment, is exactly these questions of how do we do democracy? How do we do politics that is beyond the human? How do we literally build polis, build a community that is not just human, that is also including into our political negotiations and diplomacy, coronaviruses, plants, animals, and their particular representatives. Crucially also, important questions arise around representation. What is it to represent when representation is not about human voice or representing through human voice? Important questions about the role of sciences come in here, but also important questions around the role of arts in rethinking representation for the kind of politics that we should be dealing with in order to move forward on the climate change question. So that's roughly where I come from, but you might be wondering, what are the implications of any of this for what we're here to talk about, cross-disciplinary kind of perspectives in particular on climate change? One of the things I hope you get from my analysis is this. Cross-disciplinary approaches for me are absolutely fundamental to actually coming at the questions of cosmology, coming at the questions also of climate politics and the problem that we are dealing with. In that sense, cross-disciplinary thinking isn't just an optional add-on. It isn't just something that we do once we have good economics and good international relations and good cosmology. In fact, the problem is that both the sciences and the social sciences and the humanities, they all have particular thinking problems. In some senses, in terms of my research, they're also part of the same problem field, if you like, of thinking. So to deal with the challenges that arise from that, you actually need to work across different fields because we can't solve the problems from within international relations. I'm intensely aware that my field, my disciplinary field, is not able to even touch properly the question of climate change because we are embedded in such a humanist, limited understanding of what it means to do politics. To think beyond these disciplinary boundary limitations, we need to speak across fields. So for me, in a sense, interdisciplinary working, cross-disciplinary working is fundamental to dealing with these questions. Crucially, secondly, for me, cross-disciplinary working is also inherently political. It has important political implications. It is precisely because of cross-disciplinary working that we can actually politically engage the world and beings around us in a different way, potentially. So in that sense, for me, cross-disciplinary working is really important. Arts is also very important in this cross-disciplinary work. And I wanted to say this briefly, because in the social sciences, and also I believe in the natural sciences, we are quite often, at least I am, by skills, limited in terms of being able to revisualize, reimagine different kinds of worlds. That's partly because almost imprinted in my brain, at least, is a political image of the world structured by states, that map of the world with multiple states on it. It's very hard to think beyond that. But through arts and engagement with arts, at least for me, completely new ways of representing the world have come alive. And that's why I think arts also is really important in this cross-disciplinary conversation between sciences, social sciences, and then humanities and arts. So that's, I suppose, my pitch to you, that I'm very keen to hear how you developed ideas about cross-disciplinarity for your own research, but also for me, there's a fundamental role, I think, for this sort of research. But what might be the challenges then, brief, for cross-disciplinary working? There are lots of different ways of thinking about challenges in this area. Often we talk about the difficulties in languages that we speak. So in literal senses, we speak different languages in different disciplines, and that creates difficulties of working across fields. We also have certain technical adequacy issues in working across different fields. I am unable to do artistic things. I'm also limited in certain aspects of my mathematical skills, even though I'm working on them, but others are similarly limited. These challenges are important, it's a fair point. There's also important sociological challenges. So different publication expectations for early career scholars in particular actually sometimes can prevent people getting actually even jobs. So job panels often look for particular kinds of markers of disciplinary contributions. Even the ref panel, while it allows for cross-disciplinary working, there are certain sets of limitations to how much cross-disciplinary working actually takes place within that. So often it's actually difficult also to do cross-disciplinary work. These challenges are important for sure, but I want to talk about two challenges in particular that I see as actually more problematic, or at least I feel more intensely. One of them is doing cross-disciplinary work, which is simply done because it's meaningful and important, not just because it serves the interests of particular states or particular funders in terms of kind of solving the climate change problem. One of my concerns about climate change problem is that it's in part the idea that we think that we can solve it because we sit on top of the planet and can manage the planet as if it was our role so to do, is actually part of the problem of climate change. That's why we got to this problem in the first place. So what I'm concerned about actually is quite often the ways in which cross-disciplinary work can be instrumentalized for the purposes of managing populations or managing nature. And in that sense, actually, I would encourage us, in a sense, to think beyond simply that, and actually think about really truly meaningful basic research around cross-disciplinary challenges. Secondly, I wanted to briefly highlight the challenges of both patience and time when it comes to thinking about cross-disciplinary research. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of patience to do cross-disciplinary work. Patience in terms of listening to others, learning new skills, and taking time, in a sense, to do that. Cross-disciplinary working is not easy, but it requires a great deal of patience in terms of how we treat others. But also it requires a great deal of patience with ourselves, because of course, with cross-disciplinary research, your next research outcome might not come in the next year or in the next 2 months or even the next 10 years. It might take a lot longer to develop some of these ideas and the thinking and the skills that is required. And that is actually very difficult to deal with, I find, in academia, where we need to have outcomes. With that, of course, is tied the question also of time. So we need time for this kind of research. And of course, in the university system in particular, it is difficult to find time for this. But you do have time today to explore these themes. You have a whole day together to explore these themes today. So I really just would like to finish by saying good luck with that. Enjoy it. Talk to each other with patience. And with time, and then I also give you the challenge of really developing new, meaningful, interesting dialogues and ways of doing research from these dialogues. Hope you enjoy it. Sorry for taking too long, Martin, but I will stop that there.